History tells us who ruled, who rebelled, and who broke free. But it hides the stories of those who suffered in silence, the enslaved black men whose pain was not recorded, whose dignity was stolen, and whose memories were buried beneath the myth of Southern gentility. They were not only chained in fields, they were trapped inside a system that turned every breath into obedience and every glance into risk. Behind the lace curtains of plantation houses, behind smiles polished for visitors, lay a darkness no one dared to name. The world saw civility, manners, and wealth. But the enslaved saw something nastier, an invisible cruelty that moved through quiet rooms and polite voices. Some called these women angels of the household, yet in the shadows, a different truth whispered, when power has no limits, even tenderness can turn into torment. They said the masters were cruel, but what if the mistresses were hiding something darker? What if the hands that poured tea also enforced silence? The plantations of the American South were built not only on labor, but on fear. Fear that kept men from speaking, fear that taught them that resistance meant disappearance. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the South prided itself on refinement. Yet beneath every marble staircase and chandelier was a foundation made of suffering. Plantations looked like palaces, but they were prisons disguised as homes. The men who tilled the fields carried more than chains on their wrists. They carried secrets that could never be told. White women were publicly cast as delicate, pure, incapable of cruelty. But in private, some used the same system that oppressed them to claim authority over others. Legally, they were bound to their husbands. Socially, they were bound to a code of silence. Yet within their domestic realm, they wielded terrifying control. They commanded servants, decided punishments, and governed the intimate spaces where no law existed. For enslaved men, there was no safe place, not even within the walls meant to shelter. Orders could be given with a whisper. Punishment could come with a smile. A single act of refusal could cost a life. They were forced to read the faces of those who owned them. Every gesture, every tone, a warning. Society worshipped an image of feminine innocence, but that image often hid something filthy. Power exercised without conscience. The same hands that embroidered fine linen could sign the orders for beatings. The same lips that quoted scripture could threaten those who disobeyed. The contradiction was complete. In public, virtue. In private, domination. Even within oppression, some found a way to oppress others. White mistresses who felt powerless in a patriarchal world discovered control through those even more powerless. They used authority over enslaved people to feel agency, to punish, to command, to remind themselves that they too could rule something. And for enslaved men, that rule could become unbearable. Every interaction became a test of survival. A compliment could be a warning. A summons could be a sentence. These men lived at the mercy of whims they could never predict. Compliance was not agreement. It was the only way to live another day. Their silence was not acceptance. It was strategy. Behind closed doors, reality fractured. The household, that sacred symbol of virtue, became a theater of power. Historians later found diaries and letters where mistresses wrote about favoring certain servants or keeping them close to the house. Harmless words on paper until you read between the lines. Close often meant control. Favoring meant ownership of body and life. These acts were not affection. They were assertion of dominance. Each demand stripped away humanity. And because society refused to see white women as capable of cruelty, these abuses hid behind respectability. The enslaved could not accuse, the courts would not listen, and history chose not to remember. Imagine living in a world where every command might carry an unspoken threat, where even a moment of eye contact could mean punishment, where silence became both shield and wound. In such a world, the only weapon left was endurance. Yet the system itself demanded silence. Publicly, white womanhood was celebrated as the heart of moral virtue. Privately, it was protected by denial. The enslaved men's suffering could never be acknowledged because it shattered the fantasy of purity that Southern culture depended on. Forgot the faces of those men who stood in the background of portraits, the nameless figures blurred behind polished white families. They became ghosts inside the very history they built, remembered only as workers, never as human beings who carried unbearable secrets. The records of their lives were edited, erased, or softened by historians who feared the truth would stain the image of the Southern lady. The paradox of white womanhood was one of America's most haunting illusions. These women were raised to embody virtue, but many became instruments of cruelty. Subtle, psychological, and deeply disturbing. While white men ruled through physical violence, some mistresses ruled through emotional control. They understood humiliation as power. They understood silence as weaponry, and they used both with precision. Within the private quarters of these homes, boundaries disappeared. Servant rooms, kitchens, corridors, every corner carried tension. The air itself was thick with command and fear. There was no witness, no one to intervene. Only whispers survived, passed through generations and half-told stories. She called me to her room, one man might say. I had no choice. Few words, heavy with everything that could not be spoken aloud. Historians later uncovered fragments, letters in faded ink, plantation logs that list house servants, repeatedly mentioned by name. Some entries marked with strange notes, transferred to main quarters, assigned to night duty, kept near mistress. Each phrase an echo of domination dressed in the language of routine. To the outside world, these mistresses were paragons of virtue, model wives, and mothers. Inside their homes, they could become something else entirely, untouchable figures who demanded obedience with terrifying intimacy. A glance, a word, a gesture was enough to summon fear. To disobey was to risk everything. For the enslaved men, it was a nightmare wrapped in civility. The cruelty wasn't always loud. Often it was slow, deliberate, and suffocating. The humiliation of having no say over one's own existence. The confusion of being punished for showing fear or punished for not showing enough. These men lived in a constant negotiation between survival and self-respect, a negotiation that no one should ever have to make. There are diaries from the era that speak of loyalty and affection between mistress and servant. But the language deceives. These words were written by those in power, masking coercion as devotion, obedience as love. The enslaved were denied their own voices, so their pain had to hide between the lines. The truth became invisible, buried beneath polite words and social grace. Imagine what it meant to wake each day knowing your life was not your own, your body a possession, your silence the price of safety. Imagine the exhaustion of pretending not to see the cruelty around you, because to notice was to endanger yourself. For the enslaved men, every day was an act of endurance, every night a rehearsal for survival. This system thrived on contradictions. It demanded moral purity from white women while giving them unchecked control over black lives. It preached faith and virtue while feeding off the suffering of others. And it silenced any truth that didn't fit the narrative. When historians later asked why so few accounts existed, the answer was simple. Because silence was forced, and memory itself became dangerous. Early scholars of American history ignored these stories, not because they were unknown, but because they were inconvenient. To admit that white mistresses could be cruel, manipulative, or abusive was to destroy the fantasy of Southern femininity that justified the entire social order. So, generation after generation, the archives remained clean while the truth stayed filthy, hidden in the corners of oral histories and family secrets. But the truth never truly disappears. It lingers in the ruins of old plantations, in the pain carried through generations, in the quiet defiance of descendants who still feel the weight of what was never confessed. In the 20th century, a few historians began to listen differently. They reread the old documents not as records of civility, but as evidence of oppression. They began to understand what the missing voices meant, what the silences revealed. The so-called grace of the South was built on erasure. Its beauty was polished with denial. These discoveries shattered the myth of innocence. The idea that cruelty was only the domain of men collapsed under the weight of evidence. Diaries that once seemed harmless now read like confessions of complicity. Estate records that listed servants now looked like ledgers of human suffering. To confront this truth is to see the South not as a land of charm and gentility, but as a place where exploitation hid behind every smile. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Who benefits from forgetting? Who gets to be remembered as gentle? And who is condemned to be silent? The emotional cost of this silence stretched far beyond the plantations. For the enslaved men, the abuse was not something that ended when the day's labor stopped. It followed them into their dreams, haunted their sense of self, and distorted the meaning of manhood. In a world that denied them freedom, even their pain was not their own. It had to remain hidden, buried beneath strength, because weakness could be used against them. When freedom finally came, many carried their trauma quietly, unwilling or unable to speak it. How do you confess something that the world refuses to believe? How do you explain the kind of degradation that defied language itself? For generations, the pain was passed like an unspoken inheritance, shaping lives in ways few could name. Families noticed the silence, but not its origin. Communities bore the burden of unacknowledged wounds that history refused to heal. The psychological toll was devastating. Shame mixed with anger, confusion mixed with despair. The memory of forced obedience eroded identity, turning survival into something both triumphant and tragic. Even in moments of resistance, these men were trapped between fear and dignity, forced to navigate a world that offered neither justice nor understanding. And all the while, society crafted its own illusions. The white mistress was remembered as the grieving wife, the gentle matron, the embodiment of moral restraint. The enslaved men were written out, their voices erased from the record. It was as though their suffering was too inconvenient, too destabilizing for a culture that worshipped white virtue and feared black truth. When historians revisited this history, they found themselves confronting centuries of silence. In dusty archives and forgotten attics, letters whispered the truth. He was faithful, one note read, always near me. Another spoke of a servant who had to be disciplined for insolence, though the tone revealed more possession than punishment. These fragments painted a chilling picture, not of passion, but of control, not of devotion, but of dominance hidden beneath domestic routine. In the late 20th century, a new wave of scholars, black historians, feminist researchers, truth seekers, began to challenge the old narratives. They saw the patterns no one else wanted to see. They read between the lines of plantation journals, recognizing what loyalty and obedience truly meant. They uncovered testimonies that revealed the invisible violence of gender and race intertwined. One historian described it as the last taboo of slavery, a truth too dark to fit the romantic myth of the antebellum South. Another called it a crime buried beneath the language of civility. Together, their research forced America to face the uncomfortable reality that the plantation was not only an economic machine, it was a system of complete domination, where power reached into every aspect of human existence. For descendants, these revelations brought pain and clarity. Some families, long proud of their Southern heritage, were confronted with letters and records that rewrote everything they believed. For Black families, the research gave words to what their ancestors could never safely say. It connected the unspoken dots between silence, shame, and survival. In documentaries and museums today, historians tread carefully when they speak of these stories. They understand the danger of sensationalizing trauma, but they also understand the greater danger of forgetting, because forgetting turns cruelty into myth. Forgetting makes the powerful seem innocent and the victims invisible. To tell these stories is not to assign blame. It is to give the past its truth, to honor those who had none. Every whispered story, every record that survived, becomes a small act of justice. It's a way to restore humanity where it was deliberately taken away. The legacy of this history still lingers. You can see it in the inherited mistrust of institutions, in the deep need for recognition and respect, in the continuing fight to control one's own narrative. The descendants of both the oppressors and the oppressed walk through a world shaped by silences their ancestors created or endured. When we visit the ruins of old plantations today, the cracked walls, the abandoned quarters, the quiet fields, we're not just looking at the remnants of an economy, we're standing in the echo of a moral collapse. Each room that once held secrets still carries the residue of fear. Each path once walked by enslaved men still remembers their footsteps. The final reflection comes with the understanding that power, when unchecked, always seeks to own more than it deserves. It seeks to define, to silence, to erase. But truth, no matter how long it is buried, has a way of surfacing. The stories of those men, once hidden in shadows, now demand the light. Their endurance was not just survival, it was resistance. Every day they lived was an act of defiance against a world that tried to break them completely. Their silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Their memory is not shame, it is proof that even in the darkest systems, humanity finds a way to endure. And so, we tell their story, not to reopen wounds, but to allow healing through acknowledgement. The past cannot be undone, but it can be faced with honesty. The final voice speaks softly, almost like a prayer. The abuse enslaved men suffered under white mistresses exposes the deepest cruelty of slavery, a cruelty built on silence, sustained by fear, and forgotten by comfort. Their stories were stolen once. They cannot be stolen again. To remember them is not to hate. It is to understand the cost of forgetting.